This has been highly requested from those of you guys who have picked up coffees from the Asia Roasting Profile project, which is How to Espresso. I'm going to start off with doing an espresso guide, and then I will do probably a few brewing guides on some of these coffees. We're just going to go over very general approaches and what to look for, what to kind of taste for. For those of you who have stumbled upon this video, I have been working on basically taking the roasting profile found in Asia and bringing it here, recreating those profiles, and getting those coffees out there. So I currently have 4 coffees, just launched 2 new coffees, and I'm just very, very excited about this. And you can totally check it out, link in the description. Now, this is really a video for those of you guys who have bought the coffees and who are planning on buying the coffees, but you can really take a lot of the things that I am saying and a lot of the kind of thought process and mentality on brewing these coffees, especially as espresso, and apply them to a ton of different things. Now, I want to start off and just talk a bit about acidity, especially in something like espresso. And I think this is what's going to be the biggest difference between a lot of the Asia roasting profiles that you'll find out of the 4 coffees we have right now and future coffees versus what you might be used to drinking now. For example, this beautiful Kenyan from Say, very, very expressive coffee in terms of acidity and vibrancy, and I think that's just due to the roasting profile. I generally observe a lot of American roasters, a lot of Western, European roasters focusing on transparency. Roast the coffee in a very transparent way, light, generally speaking, and what ends up happening is the acidity is usually very, very upfront, very, very vibrant, very, very structured, and that is how I would typically characterize a lot of Western roasting styles. When we shift and look at a lot of the Asia roasting styles, especially East Asia, for example, Taiwan and Hong Kong and all of that, I feel like what happens is these roasters want to focus on sweetness. So why does this kind of matter for something like espresso? The kind of biggest difference that I find is where does this acidity appear when you sip the espresso? So for example, is the acidity very, very upfront? Or does the acidity take a second before it hits you? Or how does the acidity really blend into the rest of the shot? Is it the first thing you experience? Is it the second thing you experience? Is it where, what is the level of acidity compared to everything else? And the really cool thing with espresso is you can drastically modulate how that acidity presents itself. Kind of when I think about the Asia roasting profile, I think about sweetness. So in my mind, the general approach to that is, well, how do I then take acidity and blend it into the rest of the shot and make the shot finish very, very sweet? Because if what I am experiencing through a majority of the shot is sweetness in some sort of way, then I think that is pretty representative of a lot of these roasting profiles. So I think there are 2 big approaches to achieving sweetness in your espresso. One is you can try to do all this espresso profiling stuff to actually emphasize sweetness. And the second is you can actually just try to play to the profile's strength. Try to play to the coffee's strengths of, if the coffee is sweet, how do I pull a shot of espresso that is actually quite transparent and honors that coffee and showcases the sweetness? Before I dive into those big methods and approaches, I definitely want to talk a bit about what variables and what things you can adjust, what actually kind of influences a lot. Obviously, the first thing is the actual profile you pull. The way you add water over coffee, or in this case, an espresso puck, really changes a lot of things, especially with something like acidity. And I really want to focus on acidity because I think the biggest difference between the Western approach and the Eastern approach, or a lot of these Asia roasting profiles, is just where does acidity appear, especially in something like an espresso? Because espresso is very, very volatile, it's very, very upfront and emphasizes everything, it's very intense. So what you kind of want to think about is, well, okay, how do I control this acidity? And working with something like a machine that offers profiling, like the Sanremo U, a Fleur 58, a Nomad, PicoPresso, all of that is going to be very, very helpful. And also the ratio that you use. Second is definitely going to be the grinder. If you have a grinder that is very, very transparent or emphasizes sweetness or, controls where the acidity comes up, that is going to also be helpful. So, if you have multiple grinders, pick which grinder emphasizes sweetness the most. I think that is what is a lot of fun. Or maybe even transparency, which is something that we'll talk about after this part. And third is the ratio. So ratio, I think, is very interesting because I think, generally speaking, I find these coffees to handle really well in that 1 to 2.5 to 1 to 3. So the reason why I like that is because sometimes when you're pulling at those super small ratios like 1 to 2, it's just a little too much. It's like you can't really tell what's going on, and I want to kind of open up these coffees so I can actually experience the roasting profile. A big focus of this is, well, taste the roasting profile. How does the acidity blend into something? What is going on in the coffee? So let's chat about this first big block of category, which is how do you boost sweetness in espresso? Well, basically, I think profiling is the biggest thing here that can benefit you just easily. The biggest difference that I have observed and what I like to do now, especially with these ARP coffees, is definitely slower pre-infuse. Doing a very, very slow pre-infusion emphasizes a massive amount of sweetness for me. Basically, try pulling a really, really fast fill, like a hardcore lever style, slam the puck with a ton of water, versus a very, very slow pre-infusion. And what I think you'll observe is how does the acidity shift? I feel like what happens with the very slow pre-infusion is the acidity actually is not the most apparent thing that you will taste. It is going to kind of be more rounded and more integrated. I think for these coffees, I want to tame that acidity in some sort. I want to take this acidity that might be like way up here, and I want to just kind of mellow it out. I want to round it out, and I want my shot to be very rounded. So what I like doing is just doing slower pre-infusion, then ramping up to about 4 or 5 bars. Your flow rate is probably going to be around 3.5, 4 mils per second, and then ramping things down. Doing that slow pre-infusion really helps tame that acidity and mellow things out and blend everything together and create a sweeter shot, because what you are experiencing is, well, more of the style of the shot, not this emphasized acidity that, in my opinion, would like peak up like this, but round it out and make everything very, very smooth, integrated, and nice and sweet. Because, well, if you're profiling it correctly and you're using a decent enough grinder, the coffee will kind of carry the story. Now I want to chat a bit about just grinders briefly, and then we'll pull the shot. So grinders and burrs are gonna make a big difference here. What you just want to adjust is the amount of pre-infusion time, and more so just like what is your overall shot length here. If you have something like 98 ml flats that extract very, very fast, what you might want to do is actually not do such a long pre-infusion because your shot might become too muddy. And maybe your overall shot time should not be more than like 35 seconds. With a lot of these fast flowing, high extraction 98 flats like SSP Brew, for example, you can probably pull a 20, 25 second long shot and be completely fine. Even things like 64 MP, things that are extremely fast flowing. I'm using a Caftech grinder here, so I actually really enjoy things around 30 seconds. And then if you're on something like a Niche Zero, Lego Mini, more traditional conical burrs, I actually think you can focus on pulling slightly longer shots. We're essentially pulling a low pressure lever profiles, and you can actually have a longer pre-infusion time and have a shot that is around 35, 40, 45 seconds, and that should taste completely fine. What you just want to focus on is if you are tasting muddiness, you probably want to back off on the amount of pre-infusion time and also how fine you are grinding. But overall general structure is, again, if you have fast, high extracting burrs, your overall shot time is probably going to be shorter, and if you have slower extracting burrs, like traditional conicals, you can do a longer shot, but play around with the amount of time you pre-infuse. We're going to do a slow pre-infusion. We're going to pre-infuse around 2 bars. Once we get the first 2 to 3 grams in cup, we're then just gonna ramp up to around 5 bars, and then we're gonna ramp down. It's very difficult. Basically, I am pre-infusing at 2 bars here. And then once I see the actual basket fill and I start to get a few drops in the cup here, I'm getting about 1 gram. I'm going to ramp up to 5 bars. And And then I'm going to ramp down. This is about a 1 to 2.5 here, 43.2 grams in, so 18 in, 43.2 out, 34-second long shot. So I spent a fair bit of that shot pre-infusing, and the rest is just very, very slow, gentle ramp up, and then ramp down. And this is really what takes that acidity, even with something like these Shuriken light medium burrs that emphasize acidity up front, this can help tame that and take that acidity and kind of mellow it out and blend it out. And because we're pulling such a low pressure, we kind of help round things out and emphasize sweetness. It's very late right now because this is when I record these videos, so I am not going to taste this. But yeah, that is definitely an approach that, oh, wow, this coffee's smelling great, that you can go for. I think generally the reason why that sweetness stuff works is because most of these coffees emphasize sweetness in some sort of way. It is where the acidity appears in these coffees and just boosting all of that in an espresso. I think it's really fun. If you've been only tasting Western lightly roasted styles of coffee and you're pulling piss, you're pulling soup, you're pulling super, super fast flowing shots that push the acidity all the way up, this is going to be that polar opposite. This is going to be that, let's tame the acidity, let's blend it together. It might be muddy to some of you guys, but I think that's what's fun about these shots, is like, this is what makes the rest of the shot rounded, tasty, sweet, and it's going to be very different than what you might be used to. So now let's shift gears and talk about transparency in espresso. You can totally take these ARP coffees and you can pull them in a high clarity, high transparency method. You're gonna take that profile we just did here, but do everything just a little bit faster. And I want to emphasize that these are not the lightest roasted coffees in the world, okay? So you don't actually want to do your crazy fast turbo fills. You want to do a little bit of that, but really what will help boost that transparency and allow you to taste the profile more is to extend the ratio out. And kind of what you just want to be aware of is the actual contact time, or the length of your shot. Basically, if you have a too long of a shot, time-wise, and also maybe length, what you might end up experiencing is the coffee is going to start falling apart. Is that you've pushed the coffee too hard because the flow rate is too fast. In that case, you should grind a little bit finer, and vice versa. You can just actually take the same exact grind size you used for the first shot, okay? And what we will do is we will pre-infuse a little bit faster. We're gonna soak the puck with a little bit more water. I would just basically take whatever flow rate you're doing and double it. It's not that complicated. The first shot that we did, which is that slow pre-infusion, emphasize sweetness style shot, the pre-infusion fill was just around 4 mils per second. And I think a very safe starting point is to just double that. So we're gonna go for an 8 mil per second fill. Depending on what burrs you have, play around with how fast and how high of a flow rate you actually want to go when you fill. I find that things like your niche zeros, your traditional conical burrs, handle a little bit better still with the slower flow rates, and you can just go faster and faster depending on if you have 64 flats, 98 flats, and what high extraction, high clarity burst sets like that. Those can handle the fill speed. But basically, a good starting point, just double it, and the rest of the shot you can just do the exact same thing. And what we really just want to do is we want to extend our ratio out just a little bit more. So in this case before, we pulled 42, 43 out. Let's try to pull 18 to 60. So now we're going, a little bit larger ratio, and that is going to also help emphasize clarity in the coffee. Wow. Okay. So my ramp up pressure is still the exact same as before. I just basically filled it at double the flow rate. So 60 out, 60.1. same time, 32 seconds on this shot. The difference here was that fast fill at the beginning, or I would say faster fill at the beginning. It's really cool what you can do with the profiling. What you can do, as you saw I just did there, was I really modulated the taper at the end. Honestly, the biggest difference is going to just be because of that larger ratio, and doing that larger ratio is going to help you taste things a little bit better, and the profile should come out. What I think is fun about trying to pull the more transparent styles of shots is just basically play around with how aggressive you fill at the beginning. I actually think as long as you're targeting low pressure, you can keep just extending the ratio out. And if you're experiencing or tasting any sort of muddiness, you either need to back off on the ramp up flow rate and also maybe lower your temperature. And I think those are the two things that really help you do stuff like 1 to 10, like Sprovers. Just basically kind of lower the temperature and flow rates the larger ratio you go. And it depends on really, what is your acceptable definition of an espresso before it becomes too thin. But I think just kind of playing it very, very safe, just basically doubling that flow rate and also playing around with a little bit larger ratio is going to be very helpful. And again, we're using the same grind size, so that's what's really cool about tapping into a little bit of the profiling here. If you have a machine that does not have profiling, I think the best bet you can do is actually adjust your dosages and adjust your ratios. You can mimic a lot of what I've just done here by just up dosing or down dosing and looking at what is that peak pressure or peak flow rate that your machine is targeting. And if you know that number, it's going to be very, very helpful. But I just wanted to provide you guys two approaches, okay? One is just try to pull espresso in a way that is sweet, that does kind of go with the vibe of these ARP coffees, which generally speaking is quite sweet. Or two, pull in a very transparent way, a transparent way that does showcase the profiles that you find in these coffees, which also are sweet. So two different approaches is like, are you tasting the profile that is sweet in that form, or are you tasting the coffee, which is also sweet? And really what I'm trying to showcase is that these are just different profiles that you can find in roasting. And I think for me, what has been most interesting is actually emphasizing sweetness in some sort of way, whether it be through the way you brew and pull shots, or just through enjoying the coffee itself, which is like a transparent way. So yeah, that's really what I wanted to chat about today, is just ARP coffees, approaches, methodology, especially in something like espresso. And again, I want to thank everyone who's ordered. We have new coffees that are constantly kind of coming out every single few weeks, which is awesome. At a later date, I don't know when, I'm going to also release the brew guide with, if you're hand pouring, and also for something like AeroPress. But these are kind of just, good starting points as to what you should do, especially if you are trying to pull these coffees on espresso, and what you should kind of look for, more so taste for. But thanks everyone for buying the coffees, trying the coffees out, and thanks everyone who's given me feedback. If you have any questions, let me know, but otherwise check out everything. It'll be link in the description, and I'll see you guys around.